I'm King Link, and today let's do a design review on No Kuni 2, which is one of the most impressive Japanese RPGs I've played in quite a while, possibly for the entirety of this console generation. As always, rather than just a standard review, we're going to focus more on why No Kuni 2 stands out and what it does to elevate itself above other games in its genre. And that genre, of course, is Japanese RPGs, or JRPGs. They kind of have become a standard fare. They've been around since the late 80s, and most stick to the same tropes every time. We're going to start with the beginning of the story here, and this is Prince Evan, a prince of Ding Dong Dell, whose father, the king, has been murdered in a bloody coup. So yes, this is a standard JRPG trope already. However, much of the game is focused on Evan's desire to build a peaceful kingdom, and we'll return to that story a bit, but what's important is that even though he wants a peaceful kingdom, and most games start that way, you actually see him building the kingdom rather than, oh, it just happens in the background. So that is actually a pretty good improvement. We also have another main character here, Roland, and on-screen is an older version of Roland from the opening cutscenes, where he is what I would call the President of the United States. At least that's a presidential seal I recognize. I'm going to skip talking more about this because really it only comes up again at the final hours of the game. It's just strange that the game starts with a version of a president from Earth, which is clearly from Earth, and does nothing with it, even with those final moments. I think it's a wasted potential, but the idea was so over the top I have to mention it, which maybe that was the point of including it. Roland is actually who I focus most of my playthrough on. He'll run around, shoot enemies with his pistols, slice enemies with his swords. Honestly, I'd vote for Roland. Sadly, Earth and his former presidency really doesn't appear to have a huge impact in the story, but I do love the guts of doing this, especially in 2018. It just feels like it needed more of a reason to exist in the story, though. The characters of No Kuni 2 are a little bit older than the characters in the first game in the series, and while Evan is still a young prince, he takes on a large amount of responsibility, making him seem older. These characters have real problems, and while there is an adventure going on like always, there's also a lot more at stake with this adventure. And the game makes that clear. As such, the story feels like it's more developed and more mature because of this. The anime style as well is really solid, and the game is just beautiful at times. The anime cutscenes are a little bit rare for the game, but the character designs are top-notch, and there's some great work here. You're going to want to keep pressing on to see the next scene, character, location, or just action. One thing that keeps No Kuni 2 moving towards that next scene in the story is the battle system itself. Instead of a modal battle system that has to switch from a map to battle screen to reward screen, requiring multiple loading times and breaks in action, the battles in No Kuni 2 are done seamlessly in dungeons, so players will fluidly drop in and out of battles quickly as they're moving towards their goals. And besides, the battles themselves are rather fast, even on the world map screen, which does have minor loading times. Most battles will take under 60 seconds, though if I'm honest, I think they probably are closer to 20 seconds. I wasn't timing them, of course. While there are a decent amount of enemies that can feel like a grind, with the quicker battles, they don't feel like a bad experience and are just minor inconveniences that the player will have to get through a map. Admittedly though, the battle system isn't perfect here. In an early patch, the developers added difficulties into the game, and I played most of No Kuni 2 on Expert, the highest tier which gives the best rewards. Even on Expert though, there's not a lot of challenge in this game if you can dodge attacks. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to play this at launch with just normal in the game. Granted, I'd rather a game be too easy than too hard, but still, the difficulty even with Expert is extremely weak. The dungeons in No Kuni 2 are well paced and they don't feel indulgent. There's not many extremely long dungeons here. In fact, the one on the screen was a rescue mission, which involved just a single boss battle, and while that feels like it sets up a trap at the nearest town, it's not actually. Many dungeons in No Kuni 2 are shorter than the average dungeons in JRPGs, but that works well with the game trying to tell an important story and allows for better pacing of the narrative. Rather than spend 2 to 3 hours slogging through a single dungeon with almost no cutscenes, No Kuni 2 focuses more on shorter and more interesting dungeons with minor puzzles. You see, No Kuni 2 does something that I feel like most JRPGs don't do that often. It values the player's time and feels like the player is making constant progress. I was ready for that big level jump which mandates grinding of enemies that's in almost every JRPG, but it never happened here. However, this isn't a discussion of grinding. Instead, it's about the massive number of ways Ni no Kuni 2 provides the player with an enjoyable experience, mostly resting on the quality of life improvements and a lack of forced gameplay systems. I can only imagine that this game was playtested a lot, as almost anything the player wants to do is offered, and most optional content is not required. The biggest example of this is the game's ability to travel through trip doors. That's what the game's calling them. If you find a trip door, which is shown as a blue indicator on the screen, you can fast travel to that location from anywhere in the game when you're not in a battle. That sounds good, but once you start using it, it's incredible. There's usually 2 or 3 of these in any large dungeon, so if you need to return to town, you can return to where you were in the dungeon in seconds. This means that if there's a boss at the end of the dungeon and you're underleveled or need some gear, you can usually leave and do what you need, then return to the dungeon when desired and arrive at the end of the dungeon rather than having to go through it a second time. I admit I didn't use this function for about 10 hours as the game was mostly linear there, and there wasn't a real need for it. But once I started using the trapdoors, I never stopped because they were hugely beneficial to the point that I was considering using them just to teleport around towns. I didn't need to do that often, but it was a valid option. One other piece of dungeons in Ni no Kuni 2 is that they're always interesting. Dungeons are always going to be in RPGs, no matter what, but most games have a major flaw in that there's a clear design to the dungeon. Dungeons will have a selected theme, and then you walk through multiple screens with minimal interactions with the dungeon or the background, and then at the end of every dungeon, without fail, is a boss battle, no matter where the story is supposed to be taking you. Ni no Kuni 2 rarely follows these rules. Dungeons and bosses can occur together, but oftentimes bosses are about the story progression. You might have to fight like an Incineraptor here. This is a major boss that the players have to get an item from, but it actually was in a dungeon that players traveled through earlier. There's also a couple bosses that are in very small caverns as well. There's no set pattern to Ni no Kuni 2's dungeon or story progression. Like the rule of 3 itself only happened I think one time in the game. This made me more interested in going to the next section of the game because I didn't know what I'd find, and the fact is I didn't feel like I had to repeat the same action of a long dungeon followed by a standard boss. Made it more interesting to find out if there was either going to be a dungeon, boss, or one of the rare times that they had both. Considering the game took me over 50 hours, it's not a lack of content or length, but a lack of repetitive pattern that kept me interested. There's not many boss battles, but every boss battle is pretty good here. There is a series of super boss battles. Exactly what these are would be spoilers, so I'm going to avoid that. Just realize that there are a couple better battles here, and these knock it out of the park. Almost every one of these super bosses are interesting and have some unique mechanic, including usually these smaller summons to gain some ability. In this one, I use them for a fire shield. These smaller characters are called Higgledies, and the gold circled ones are special for the super boss battles, and they give you some advantage, but the Higgledies are a great aspect of the battle system. I will be honest though, they could have been explained a little bit better, but you bring some with you. You can use them to summon special powers or abilities or benefits. My favorite though is the dark type, which seems the most powerful, but I really didn't go super deep into the system. Hold on to that idea that I didn't go deep with the system though for just a moment. I want to go back and talk about our main character and his desire once more. Prince Evan. Eventually, in his quest to end war for the entire world, he creates a new kingdom and names it Evermore. This becomes a major part of the game where the player can level up the town using the town's currency and get benefits from placing shops there. Evermore is like the secret sauce that makes Ni no Kuni 2 feel amazing. There are parts of it that feels like Farmville, where you collect money, build up pieces of the town, and start researching on new topics that take some time. But that comparison is unfair because players get huge benefits out of all of this research, and rather than pestering other people to do stuff in your game, you complete quests to find new residents for your town. The quest system in Ni no Kuni 2, especially the ones to get residents, are top-notch. And there's a lot of them. There's 170 quests, at least 100 citizens to recruit throughout the game. I really love collecting these quests and chasing down the goals because, similar to the battle system, many quests are rather fast. Some are just completed with your current inventory, but even quests that require players to go kill a specific target really would take you more than a few minutes at the most, especially later on in the game when the map has been fully explored and your trapdoors are all set up. As I said, the quality of life systems are good in Ni no Kuni 2. Each quest gives some money, experience, and items, so players will be rewarded no matter what they need, and is a quick way to gain levels if players feel the need to grind. So to go back to your kingdom quickly, there's a lot more happening in that kingdom, but the one piece that surprised me with it was upgrading my kingdom from level 1 to level 2. In level 1, the kingdom felt a bit small, like a town, so when I saw level 2 I was ready for a few more stores to open and maybe another small goal to reach. Instead, the kingdom doubled in size with twice as many shops available and every current shop getting new tiers of progression. This felt like a whole new addition to my kingdom, and that's what I really wanted to see. This is a major expansion, and as such, reaching level 2 is a major accomplishment, not just changing a simple value. This experience felt like the player is growing a real country rather than a small village. There's a ton more elements that we can talk about, such as skirmish battles, the tactic tweaker. There's a ton of bonus dungeons, which do repeat maps a bit too often. There's a deep inventory system if you want to explore it, and players will have a ton of little features to mess with if they want to. But that's what's important here, if they want to. Remember the higgledies? I said I didn't go super deep into them, which is true. On screen is the Tactic Tweaker, a system I never touched after I got it. I just didn't find it interesting. I saved most of the quests for the late game. I barely developed or made equipment at all. The kingdom itself was mostly developed by me in the late game as well. There's just entire features such as a couple useful spells, such as unlocking special chests and talking to spirits, I didn't even know about until the last chapter of the game. That's a lot of stuff I didn't play with. And yet, Ni no Kuni 2 never required them. It never forced me back to playing with its various doodads or missions to complete the game. If I didn't enjoy building Evermore, the game let me ignore it for the most part. If I didn't like the tactics tweaker, which I didn't like, I didn't feel penalized for ignoring it, and there was a way to recover all spent points in it if I did want to retry it later. This is the exact opposite of what Doom Eternal did. In Doom Eternal, every feature in the game had to be used by the player to maximize their chances to win, even on lower difficulties. Whereas in Ni no Kuni 2, it offered a bunch of content, and if players decided they didn't want those bonuses, they weren't forced into using them. There is a part of the player's stats and skills that are tied to each of those systems mentioned, but the key is that that's the difference between an easy win and a slightly more challenging win rather than being a complete requirement for success. That's what I found that made Ni no Kuni 2 really stand out. If a player wants to sink time into your bonus games, reward them for doing so, but at the same time, don't make those side quests and mini-games mandatory and accept that players may choose not to utilize every function of your combat system. This is one of the reasons that Triple Triad in Final Fantasy VIII or Gwent in Witcher 3 have become extremely popular. They were excellent modes that players wanted to participate in obsessively rather than required game systems that players were forced to use. I personally like Blitzball a lot in Final Fantasy X, but the initial introduction of Blitzball is an extremely difficult match that most players will lose and they'll feel jaded from that experience. When an interesting experience becomes a requirement, it's changed from a fun diversion to a chore that players have to use. There's tons more that Ni no Kuni 2 does well. An auto-equip system for gear, the ability to skip cutscenes and dialogue if players want to, great minimap icons to find where you have to go next. But what Ni no Kuni 2 is doing with each of these choices is to think of the player and not force them to play the game their way. The key is that while almost all the side content is not required, a lot of it is really fun. And if you make great content like building Evermore, players will choose to do it because they want to. I love talking about just Evermore because I enjoyed my time building that kingdom. I could imagine needing to reach a certain development goal at a bunch of different parts of the game just to progress the story, and that would have robbed so much of my enjoyment of the experience instantly because, as I mentioned, that becomes a chore. So what do I think of Ni no Kuni 2? I honestly like it a lot. I was in love with the game for a good portion of it. I have a couple of small opinions on the final hour or so, mostly to do with weird story pieces, but nothing that ruins the experience as a whole. I still adore playing the game, and I have quests I'll return to and try to complete, as well as DLC that is waiting for me. The experience of Ni no Kuni 2 is what I really enjoyed. This was a JRPG that reminded me that I still love the JRPG genre when it avoids feeling bogged down with forced mechanics, required side quests, and grinding. Ni no Kuni 2 is a light, fluffy adventure, and somehow it still feels that way after 60 hours. There's not many RPGs, Japanese or Western, that I can say that about. The story is well done, but honestly, I haven't spent that much time on the story here because a lot of JRPGs have great stories, but not many have figured out how to keep telling those stories over 60 hours without slowing the game down with its various repetitions. And that's what Ni no Kuni 2 does differently. Good game design, though, stands on its own, and Ni no Kuni 2 feels like it knocks this out of the park. This came out at the same time as Dragon Quest XI, and dear God, I wish I played Ni no Kuni 2 instead of Dragon Quest XI at the time. Luckily, that's something I can fix today. Ni no Kuni 2, though, is a complex game, so my next design review I'll be talking about one of the most simplistic games ever made, and how that simplicity made it stand out for me over 15 years after the original release. Though I do have a Humble Choice review coming out before that, so stay tuned for that. I'll be popping up 2 videos here. One I feel absolutely passionately about is my video on achievements and trophies and why I love them, as well as a video on exploration. Another thing that Ni no Kuni 2 does well is giving the player a massive world and rewarding them for exploring it. Let's see what other games do that. And until then, I'm King Link. Thanks for watching.